Imagine waking up one morning, and for a moment everything feels alive. The sun spills its golden light across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing lazily in the air. You hear the distant chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves outside, the soft rhythm of your own breath. And then quietly a sense of wonder stirs within you. This is not the thrill of a great achievement, nor the rush of success or recognition. It is something far more subtle, far more intimate, the pure, unobtrusive joy that resides in the very fabric of life itself. For the awakened, happiness is never something to chase. It does not arrive with the accumulation of wealth, accolades, or worldly approval. Instead, it is discovered in moments most people overlook: a drop of rain sliding down a window pane, the gentle fragrance of morning dew, the warmth of a cup of tea cradled in your hands. These seemingly trivial moments are, in truth, profound portals into the richness of existence. This awakening begins quietly, often without fanfare. It does not shout, it whispers. A subtle shift occurs in the way the mind perceives the world. The mind that once sought fulfillment in grand gestures and monumental events starts to notice the delicate tapestry of small, fleeting experiences. Happiness for the awakened is not a distant destination. It is embedded in the very act of being present. Consider, for a moment, the way you drink water. How often do you sip without truly noticing? Now imagine pausing, feeling the cool liquid slide down your throat, noticing the rhythm of swallowing, the clarity it brings to your senses. In that simple act, a door opens, a door to awareness, gratitude, and joy. It is astonishing how something so ordinary, when fully perceived, can ignite a quiet fire of contentment. In the teachings of Buddhism, the awakened are described as those who have trained the mind to recognize the beauty inherent in each moment. They do not cling to the past, nor anxiously grasp the future. Every breath, every heartbeat, every glance and gesture becomes an opportunity to touch the luminous presence of life itself. It is a freedom that comes not from acquiring, but from releasing, not from possessing, but from observing with an open, tender heart. And yet, this does not mean the awakened reject the world. On the contrary, they inhabit it fully, embracing each experience, joyous or painful, with clarity and compassion. They find wonder in the mundane, awe in the familiar, and a gentle reverence for the simplest rhythms of existence. A single ray of sunlight, the ripple across a pond, the laughter of a child, each holds a depth of richness that escapes those who overlook the present. It is often said that to awaken is to see with new eyes. And these eyes, unlike the eyes of the unmindful, do not measure life by size, scale, or consequence. They measure it by presence, by intimacy, by the sheer capacity to notice, to feel, to be moved. The smallest things become the most profound teachers. A leaf quivering in the wind can illustrate impermanence. A shared smile can illuminate connection. The taste of a humble meal can evoke gratitude beyond measure. In a world obsessed with accumulation and spectacle, the practice of seeing happiness in the smallest things is revolutionary. It requires slowing down, quieting the mind, and opening the heart. It asks for awareness, for surrender, and for a willingness to touch the simplicity that pulses through every moment. It is here, in this gentle observation, that life reveals its most enduring treasures. And so, the journey begins not with grand gestures, but with the invitation to notice, to truly notice. The mind awakens when it sees that the extraordinary often hides in plain sight. The subtle warmth of a morning breeze, the comforting rhythm of your own breath, the delicate dance of light across a room, these are the seeds of awakening. Each small moment, when honored and embraced, carries the potential to illuminate the mind and soften the heart. As you breathe in, consider this. The joy you seek is not out there, waiting to be claimed. It is here in the immediacy of your experience, whispering its presence through the ordinary. And with each conscious observation, each mindful pause, the ordinary begins to shimmer with meaning. The path to awakening, then, is paved with small joys, quiet, fleeting, yet infinitely profound. Here, at the threshold of awareness, the mind begins to recognize a subtle truth. Happiness is not a reward nor a prize. It is a natural flowering of attention, gratitude, and presence. And as this understanding deepens, the heart softens, the mind clears, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The awakened live in this space, where the smallest things, a leaf, a smile, a breath, a ray of sunlight, are invitations to joy. This is not a promise of endless pleasure, but an opening to a profound, enduring contentment that transcends circumstance. Each moment holds within it the potential for awakening, if only we have the eyes to see, the heart to feel, and the courage to slow down. And as this awareness takes root, it naturally leads to the next step of the journey, discovering the inner source of joy, the quiet wellspring that allows happiness to flourish even amidst the noise of the world. There is a quiet magic in understanding where true happiness comes from. The awakened have discovered a subtle truth. Joy is not something to be hunted, not a prize hidden at the end of effort. It is not stored in a vault of achievements, nor carried in a pocket of possessions. It is a wellspring that lives within, ever present, waiting only for the mind to pause, listen, and drink from it. Think for a moment of a still pond at dawn. On the surface, ripples occasionally appear, the wind, a falling leaf, yet beneath, the water remains calm, deep, and untouchable. The mind of the awakened mirrors this pond. External events may stir the surface, yet the source of joy runs far deeper than circumstance. It is rooted in clarity, understanding, and a gentle attunement to life as it is. Most of us, however, have been trained to look outside ourselves. We search for happiness in applause, in accumulation, in comparison. And each time we grasp, we find it slipping away. The awakened turn inward. They explore the terrain of the mind, discovering that joy is inseparable from awareness. It is not a reward. It is a natural byproduct of seeing clearly, of living authentically, of embracing the impermanence and intimacy of each moment. Consider the simple act of sitting quietly. At first, it may seem mundane, a few minutes in stillness with nothing to accomplish. But in this stillness, the mind begins to notice the rhythm of the breath, the subtle tension in the body, the flow of thought passing without grasping. From this awareness arises a small, radiant joy, a recognition that life, in its simplest form, is already enough. The teachings of the Buddha speak of this inner wellspring as the mind's natural luminosity. When unclouded by craving, resentment, or distraction, the heart itself becomes a source of contentment. This is not intellectual knowledge or mere optimism. It is experiential. It is the joy that surfaces when one understands that happiness is not something external to be earned or secured, but a reflection of the mind's clarity and the heart's openness. Stories from the lives of those who have walked the path illustrate this beautifully. A monk sitting beneath a bodhi tree may have nothing but a simple robe, a bowl of rice, and the company of his own breath. Yet he smiles. Why? Because he has discovered the inexhaustible well within, a joy that does not fade with circumstance, that does not demand applause, that does not depend on luck or timing. Every breath, every heartbeat becomes a brushstroke painting the canvas of awareness with quiet, radiant delight. Even in the modern world, this principle applies. A walk through a quiet forest, noticing the hum of life, or a moment of stillness before dawn, savoring the first sip of tea, can awaken the mind to this inner source. Happiness is no longer a distant goal but an accessible experience, waiting patiently for attention, for recognition, for appreciation. And here lies the subtle genius of this joy. It cannot be lost because it is never truly held. It is not a possession but a state of being. The awakened understand that clinging to external pleasures is a fragile endeavor. The only reliable source of contentment is the mind itself. Awareness, compassion, and presence become the roots of an inner garden, yielding flowers of contentment in the most ordinary moments. It is also here that the mind begins to recognize the beauty of sufficiency. Once the mind knows where joy originates, the endless craving for more begins to soften. There is no compulsion to seek elsewhere. A meal is tasted fully, a conversation is heard deeply, A sunset is appreciated without distraction. Each ordinary experience becomes extraordinary because it is touched by presence and understood as part of the limitless inner wellspring. And so, from this place of quiet awareness, the heart begins to bloom. Gratitude emerges naturally without effort. Compassion flows freely without calculation. Every act, no matter how small, is infused with meaning. Happiness is no longer a pursuit but a companion, gentle, reliable, and luminous, present even amid the chaos of life. From this inner source of joy, the mind learns its next lesson, the capacity to notice, to appreciate, and to awaken within ordinary moments. Happiness is not contingent on grand events, nor does it demand perfection. It arises whenever the mind aligns with the present, open and aware, touching the richness of each moment without grasping, without judgment. And as this understanding deepens, it naturally invites a greater clarity, a recognition that mindfulness is the bridge between inner joy and the world around us. The small wonders of life, once overlooked, now become treasures. The very act of noticing, of paying attention, allows the mind to drink more fully from this inner wellspring. And in this gentle unfolding, the stage is set to discover how mindfulness transforms the ordinary into something luminous and alive. There is a hidden universe in the simplest of moments, a richness often overlooked in the rush of daily life. The awakened know this secret. The ordinary is extraordinary if only we pause long enough to see it. This is the essence of mindfulness, the art of fully inhabiting each moment, of seeing with clear eyes what the unmindful often miss. Imagine walking down a quiet street. Most people rush by, eyes fixed on phones or the next task, barely noticing the play of sunlight on the pavement, the scent of freshly turned soil, or the gentle sway of a tree in the breeze. But for the mindful, every detail becomes a teacher. A leaf fluttering in the wind is no longer merely a leaf. It is a lesson in impermanence. The laughter of a child is no longer background noise. It is a reminder of the fleeting, precious nature of life. The ordinary transforms into a mosaic of wonder, and each fragment carries profound meaning. Mindfulness is not complicated. It does not demand grand rituals or elaborate practices. It is simply the act of bringing full attention to what is happening right now. When washing a cup, one feels the warm water, notices the curves of the porcelain, hears the soft rhythm of liquid moving. When eating a meal, one savors the flavors, feels textures, and becomes aware of the energy nourishing the body. These acts, though simple, are portals into the extraordinary. In Buddhist teachings, this practice is known as sati, presence, awareness, mindfulness. It is the gateway through which the mind steps out of distraction and into life itself. And the beauty of this practice is that it transforms even the most mundane experiences into moments of insight and joy. A broom sweeping the floor is no longer a chore. It is a meditation. A single breath, inhaled and exhaled with attention, becomes a bridge to the vastness of existence. Consider a cup of tea. To the unmindful, it is merely a drink. To the awakened, it is an entire universe, the water drawn from the earth, the leaves nurtured by sun and rain, the hands that prepared it, the warmth spreading through the body. In mindfulness, this ordinary cup becomes a mirror reflecting the interconnectedness of all things. Joy arises naturally when we touch life with this level of awareness. But mindfulness is not only about noticing beauty, it is also about seeing life clearly in its entirety. It allows us to witness discomfort, pain, and impermanence without resistance. A storm outside mirrors the storm within, and by observing both with clarity, we cultivate equanimity. Mindfulness teaches that even suffering, when attended to fully, carries lessons and a subtle, quiet dignity. The extraordinary is not only in pleasure but in presence itself, uncolored by preference or judgment. The practice of mindfulness also heightens gratitude. Once the mind begins to observe, it cannot help but notice abundance in simplicity. A moment of silence, a gentle breeze, a fleeting smile, these become sources of profound appreciation. The awakened live in gratitude not because life is perfect, but because life is real. Each ordinary detail is imbued with meaning, and the mind opens to receive it fully. Stories abound of ordinary people discovering mindfulness in daily life. A mother washing dishes, a teacher walking through the classroom, a worker pausing on a balcony. All these moments, when attended to fully, become opportunities for awakening. The extraordinary is not hidden in rare experiences. It is woven into the fabric of life, always accessible to those who look with presence. And here lies a subtle, transformative truth. Mindfulness is the bridge between inner joy and the world outside. The inner source of joy, uncovered in stillness, finds expression in the mindful engagement with life. By attending fully to the ordinary, the mind begins to recognize patterns, connections, and beauty that were always present but unnoticed. Each moment becomes a window into the infinite richness of life. As awareness deepens, the ordinary ceases to be trivial. The hum of electricity, the sway of curtains, the rhythm of footsteps, each carries resonance, inviting reflection and presence. The awakened see not clutter or distraction, but texture, rhythm, and meaning. Life itself becomes a continuous meditation, a flowing tapestry in which even the smallest threads shine with significance. And so, through mindfulness, the stage is set for a deeper liberation. The mind that perceives the extraordinary in the ordinary becomes free from endless craving, endless comparison, and endless searching. Happiness is no longer a distant horizon but a current running through every action, every glance, every breath. In this way, mindfulness is not a practice confined to meditation cushions. It is a lens through which the ordinary becomes luminous, and the soul finds nourishment in every experience. As we sit with this awareness, we naturally begin to release the binds of desire and comparison, letting the mind settle into the quiet joy of simply being. The small wonders of life, once overlooked, now shine with a clarity that awakens both heart and mind. And from this awakening comes the next step, learning to let go of attachments and comparisons, allowing happiness to flow unimpeded through the simplicity of life itself. There is a subtle weight that most of us carry, often without realizing it, the weight of comparison. The mind constantly measures itself against others. She has more, he is happier. Why am I not there yet? These thoughts, so familiar, quietly erode the joy that might have otherwise blossomed. The awakened, however, have discovered a different path, one of release, of letting go, of turning inward to the wellspring of contentment that has always been there. Desire is a double-edged sword. On one side, it drives ambition, creativity, and growth. On the other, when unexamined, it fuels restlessness, envy, and suffering. The mind that clings to more or better cannot rest in the present moment. It overlooks the beauty in what is, always chasing what is not. The awakened see this clearly. They understand that the endless pursuit of external validation and material gain is a mirage, a fleeting shadow that never satisfies the deepest longing of the heart. Imagine a garden. The unmindful gardener constantly compares his flowers to his neighbors, measuring growth, color, and fragrance. The joy of tending the garden is lost in the shadow of comparison. The awakened gardener, however, waters each plant with care, noticing the subtle beauty in every leaf and bloom. There is no need for comparison because joy arises naturally from presence and appreciation. Each flower, each moment becomes complete in itself. The process of letting go begins with awareness. Noticing the subtle ways desire and comparison shape our thoughts is the first step toward freedom. When you catch yourself measuring, judging, or craving, pause. Breathe. Recognize that this habit, though familiar, is not the truth of your being. Happiness does not live in more, nor in better, nor in the shadow of someone else's life. It lives here now, in the simplicity and sufficiency of what is. Letting go is not about renouncing ambition or pleasure. It is about understanding their true place in life. One can still pursue goals, still enjoy experiences, still create and explore, but without allowing desire to dictate the rhythm of the heart. The awakened navigate life with a gentle balance, allowing enjoyment without attachment, effort without grasping, and action without compulsion. Consider the mind that has fully released comparison. It sees others' successes without envy, understanding that each path is unique. It celebrates joy without fear of loss and embraces suffering without resistance. This is not passivity. It is profound engagement with life, tempered by wisdom and compassion. The mind becomes a calm pond, reflecting the world without distortion, touched by clarity rather than craving. Stories abound of those who discovered freedom through release. A young monk once watched villagers chase after wealth and status, anxiously comparing themselves to neighbors and friends. He, however, focused on the simple work of his daily life, attending to each task with care and awareness. Over time, he noticed a quiet joy emerging, a contentment that no amount of money or recognition could rival. This is the power of letting go. It allows the mind to rest, and in that rest, happiness naturally arises. Desire often disguises itself as necessity. We believe we need this promotion, that recognition, that possession to be happy. Yet the awakened recognize that happiness is not contingent on acquisition. It is found in alignment with the present, in the cultivation of gratitude, and in the gentle recognition that the self is complete, even amidst impermanence. Each moment holds its own fullness, if we allow ourselves to notice. In practical terms, letting go may take small forms: appreciating a simple meal without wishing for extravagance, enjoying a walk without comparing it to others' experiences, loving without expecting reciprocity. These acts train the mind to release the habitual grasping that clouds perception. Slowly, the heavy weight of comparison lifts, revealing a spaciousness of heart previously unnoticed. And here is a quiet, transformative truth. When the mind is free from the chains of comparison and desire, ordinary life itself becomes a source of profound joy. The simple acts, a smile shared, a conversation held with presence, a breath fully inhaled, all radiate with meaning. Happiness is no longer dependent on circumstances, for it is anchored in the mind's clear recognition of what is in this moment exactly as it is. From this clarity emerges another gift: compassion. When we no longer compete or cling, we naturally open to the lives of others. We celebrate their successes, comfort their struggles, and understand their journeys without judgment. Letting go of comparison is not turning away. It is turning toward life in its entirety, fully, openly, and with a heart that has room for all. And so, having released the grip of comparison and desire, the mind is ready to encounter the world with clarity and openness. Each moment becomes a canvas for attention, each interaction a reflection of presence, and each experience an invitation to joy. This prepares us for the next step, recognizing that compassion and connection amplify even the smallest joys, making happiness not only an inner experience but a shared, luminous thread that ties life together. There is a quiet alchemy that occurs when joy is no longer confined to the self. The awakened understand that happiness, while nurtured within, expands when shared. Compassion is the bridge between inner contentment and the world around us, and through connection, the smallest joys multiply, echoing far beyond the mind's immediate awareness. Imagine a single candle in a dark room. Its light illuminates not only itself, but every corner it touches. Compassion works in the same way. A gentle word, a shared smile, a kind gesture, each ripple of care radiates outward, awakening the same recognition in others. The mind that has released comparison and desire naturally opens to this flow, discovering that the joy it seeks is inseparable from the joy it gives. The ordinary moments of life become fertile ground for compassion. A stranger's smile, the care of a friend, the subtle exchange of kindness between coworkers, all are opportunities to connect. The awakened notice these moments not as obligations, but as invitations to participate fully in life's shared pulse. Every act of empathy, however small, reinforces the sense that we are never truly alone, and that the happiness of one is deeply entwined with the happiness of all. Buddhist teachings emphasize the interconnectedness of all beings. No life exists in isolation. Each thought, word, and action reverberates through the web of existence. When one cultivates compassion, it is not merely a moral principle, it is a practical path to awakening. By softening the heart and seeing through the lens of connection, even the smallest pleasures, a leaf falling, a bird's song, the warmth of a shared glance, take on new depth and resonance. Consider the story of a traveler walking along a quiet path. He notices a child struggling to carry a heavy bundle of firewood. Instead of passing by, he offers a hand. That simple act, small as it may seem, transforms the day for both. The child feels relief and recognition. The traveler experiences the warmth of generosity, and the world itself feels momentarily lighter. Happiness, it turns out, is rarely solitary. It thrives in shared presence. Compassion also deepens our understanding of impermanence. When we see the suffering of others, we recognize that life is fragile, fleeting, and precious. This awareness does not lead to despair, but to a gentleness of heart, a softness that allows joy to bloom even amid imperfection. The awakened embrace the full spectrum of life, understanding that connection and empathy enrich every experience, even the ordinary ones we might otherwise overlook. And it is in these ordinary exchanges that the extraordinary is often found. A conversation held with presence, a listening ear, a comforting touch. These are not grand gestures, yet they carry profound significance. The awakened recognize that joy, when shared, expands beyond the individual. It becomes a luminous thread weaving through the tapestry of life, connecting hearts, minds, and moments. This is why the smallest things matter. A single act of compassion can ripple across space and time, touching lives in ways unseen. A smile offered to a stranger can brighten a day, inspire kindness elsewhere, and awaken awareness in someone who had forgotten how to notice. The awakened understand that connection, born from compassion, transforms both giver and receiver, turning ordinary interactions into moments of profound insight and joy. Through compassion, happiness ceases to be a solitary pursuit. It becomes relational, flowing through the threads that tie each being to another. The mind that sees beyond self-interest begins to recognize that suffering and joy are shared experiences, and that by softening the heart, one unlocks a deeper, more enduring contentment. And as this awareness grows, it naturally prepares the ground for a profound understanding of impermanence. Compassion teaches the mind to embrace the fleeting nature of life, to honor each connection, and to recognize that even the smallest gestures carry immeasurable weight. The ordinary is illuminated by empathy, and each moment becomes a doorway to insight, peace, and joy. In this way, the mind discovers a subtle, enduring truth. Happiness is not a solitary treasure hidden within. It is a living, breathing energy that thrives in connection, fed by compassion, and multiplied through shared awareness. From this foundation, the awakened begin to see not only the beauty in others, but also the deep, transformative power of impermanence, setting the stage to truly embrace the fleeting nature of life itself. Everything we hold dear is in motion, shifting in ways both subtle and profound. The awakened understand this fundamental truth: nothing lasts forever. Life is a river, constantly flowing, and every moment is a drop in that vast, unceasing current. To resist this truth is to invite suffering. To embrace it is to awaken to a deeper freedom, a clarity that transforms the ordinary into something luminous. Impermanence is often feared because it reminds us of loss, of endings, of the inevitability of change. Yet the awakened see it differently. They recognize that the fleeting nature of all things, a blooming flower, a laughing child, a quiet sunrise, is precisely what makes them precious. Without impermanence, there would be no urgency to notice, no sweetness in experience, no depth to joy. Consider a leaf falling from a tree. It drifts gently, spinning in the air, momentarily caught by the wind before landing softly on the ground. To the unmindful, it is nothing more than a leaf, an ordinary event. To the awakened, it is a teacher. It whispers a timeless lesson. Everything arises, everything passes, and everything is interconnected. By observing this simple act, the mind learns to release attachment, to appreciate presence, and to find beauty in transience. The practice of embracing impermanence does not mean detachment in a cold sense. It does not teach indifference. Instead, it cultivates a tender awareness that allows the heart to fully engage with life, knowing that all experiences, joyful or painful, are fleeting. This understanding transforms the ordinary into extraordinary, imbuing each moment with richness and depth. Life, when viewed through the lens of impermanence, encourages presence. Every conversation, every glance, every touch becomes significant. The laughter of a friend, the warmth of the sun, the quiet rhythm of your own breath, none of these can be held forever, and precisely because of that, each moment matters. The awakened cherish these experiences, recognizing that their impermanence is what gives them value. Stories from the lives of those who have walked the path illuminate this truth. A monk watching the sunset does not mourn its passing. He rejoices in its fleeting beauty. A parent holding a child understands that these days will not last, and so they embrace each hug, each laugh, each whispered word with full presence. In every case, impermanence becomes a guide, teaching appreciation, humility, and profound joy. Embracing impermanence also dissolves fear. When the mind recognizes that change is inevitable, it no longer clings desperately to what is. Loss, disappointment, and the passing of time cease to be threats. They become natural currents within which life flows. The awakened move with these currents rather than against them, finding freedom in acceptance and serenity in the knowledge that nothing is fixed and that everything, therefore, is alive. Even small, everyday events become moments of insight. The decay of a fruit, the fading of a flower, the final note of a song, each teaches the art of letting go, of recognizing the temporary nature of all experience. Mindfulness and impermanence work together here. Awareness allows us to see clearly, and understanding impermanence allows us to hold each moment lightly, yet fully. And it is through this lens that joy multiplies. When we are no longer grasping for permanence, we can fully inhabit what is present. A shared smile, a gentle touch, the taste of a simple meal all radiate with meaning, because each is ephemeral, irreplaceable, and singular. The awakened live in this delicate balance, appreciating the fragility of life without fear, and savoring each instant as a gift. This understanding naturally prepares the heart to recognize the profound beauty in simplicity and gratitude. By seeing that all things are transient, the mind opens to savor the present. Each ordinary moment, each small joy becomes a treasure. And as we embrace impermanence, we begin to understand a larger truth. Happiness is not something we hold onto. It is something we participate in moment by moment, flowing like the river of life itself. From this place of clarity, the heart softens, the mind becomes spacious, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Impermanence teaches us to value the present, to cultivate compassion, and to notice the hidden joy in life's smallest offerings. And from this awareness arises the next step, cultivating gratitude in the simplicity of each moment, seeing life itself as a gift to be treasured. There is a quiet power in noticing the ordinary, in pausing long enough to recognize the gifts hidden in the simplicity of life. Gratitude is not an abstract idea. It is a practice, a lens through which the mind transforms the mundane into something radiant. The awakened understand this deeply. Happiness is often found not in abundance, but in attention, in presence, in the simple acknowledgement of what is. Picture yourself sitting in the soft light of morning. The world is still quiet, save for the gentle rustle of leaves or the distant crow of a bird. You hold a warm cup of tea, feeling its heat seep into your hands. Each sip is a communion with the earth, the sun, the rain that nourished the tea leaves, and the hands that prepared it. This is gratitude in its simplest form, recognizing the miracle in what is often overlooked. Gratitude transforms perception. A walk through a park, the laughter of a child, a shared glance with a loved one. These ordinary moments, when fully attended to, become extraordinary. The awakened know that joy is inseparable from awareness. When the mind notices what is present, without judgment or desire, happiness arises naturally, quietly, like the gentle unfolding of a flower. It is often said that the unmindful chase after happiness as if it were somewhere far away. The awakened, however, understand that the seeds of joy are always here, waiting to be recognized. Gratitude cultivates the soil for these seeds to grow. By seeing the value in small acts, simple pleasures, and fleeting moments, the mind awakens to abundance that is not measured in quantity but in depth and presence. Consider the act of eating. Most people rush through meals, barely tasting or noticing. The awakened, however, savor each bite, acknowledging the effort, the nourishment, the interconnection of life that brought the food to the table. Gratitude turns a meal into meditation, an ordinary moment into a celebration of existence. Each sensation becomes a reminder of the miracle of being, and joy is born naturally from this recognition. Gratitude also softens the heart. It dissolves the subtle tension of longing and comparison. When the mind pauses to appreciate what is, it releases the constant pressure to acquire or achieve. The awakened experience a contentment that is gentle, enduring, and unshaken by circumstance. Simple acts of noticing, a shared smile, the warmth of sunlight, the scent of rain, are no longer fleeting. They become anchors for the heart. Stories of everyday life illuminate this truth beautifully. A teacher noticing the patience of a student, a mother marveling at a child's first step, a friend appreciating a quiet conversation. These small acknowledgments carry profound weight. Gratitude turns ordinary interactions into sacred moments, ordinary objects into treasures, ordinary days into a continuous unfolding of joy. The practice of gratitude is, in essence, an invitation to live fully. It asks nothing more than attention and presence. Each time we recognize a gift, no matter how small, the mind grows lighter, the heart softens, and the ordinary transforms into something extraordinary. In this way, gratitude is both a mirror and a door. It reflects the abundance already present and opens the mind to deeper appreciation, connection, and joy. From gratitude arises generosity, from recognition comes kindness, and from noticing the ordinary, the mind begins to understand the extraordinary richness of life itself. A leaf, a laugh, a shared meal, all become sources of insight, all become reminders that life, in its simplicity, is enough. And as the mind settles into this awareness, it naturally begins to extend beyond the self. Gratitude deepens connection, fosters empathy, and reinforces the understanding that happiness is not a solitary experience. The smallest joys, when appreciated, ripple outward, touching others, nurturing the bonds that make life meaningful. With this clarity, the awakened see that everyday actions, sweeping the floor, tending a garden, preparing a meal, are not mundane chores, but opportunities to engage fully with life. Gratitude transforms effort into meditation, presence into celebration, and simplicity into a source of profound contentment. And from this space of appreciation and presence, the mind is ready to learn the next step, transforming every ordinary moment into a living practice, where even the simplest actions become gateways to awakening. Life offers countless moments that, at first glance, seem mundane. Washing dishes, walking to work, preparing a simple meal, these actions are often performed automatically, without attention, stripped of meaning. Yet the awakened know a subtle, profound truth. Any act, no matter how ordinary, can become a doorway into presence, insight, and joy. Life itself is the greatest teacher, and every movement is an opportunity for practice. Consider the act of sweeping the floor. At first, it may appear as a chore, a necessity with no deeper value. But when performed with mindfulness, each stroke of the broom becomes an act of meditation. One notices the rhythm of the movement, the sound of bristles brushing the earth, the sensation in the hands and arms. The mind, fully present, begins to quiet, and the ordinary transforms into the extraordinary. Each sweep becomes an offering, a gesture of care, attention, and awareness. The awakened understand that spiritual practice is not confined to temples, meditation cushions, or formal rituals. It is the way one engages with life, the quality of attention brought to each moment. Cooking a meal can become a meditation on generosity. Eating can become a practice in gratitude. Walking can become a reflection on impermanence. Every action infused with mindfulness becomes sacred. This transformation begins with awareness. Notice your body, your breath, your surroundings. Engage fully with what you are doing, whether it is folding laundry, listening to a friend, or even responding to an email. Each act, when observed without distraction, becomes a meditation in motion. Ordinary life, approached this way, is no longer a series of tasks to complete but a continuous flow of practice, a living expression of presence and care. Stories from the lives of those who have embraced this path reveal its quiet power. A monk preparing tea does so not simply to quench thirst, but as a practice of attention and devotion. A teacher arranging books on a shelf becomes aware of the texture of the pages, the scent of ink, the joy of nurturing knowledge. Each ordinary act performed with care becomes a mirror reflecting the fullness of life. This approach also deepens compassion. As one practices awareness in small acts, one becomes attuned to the subtleties of the world around them, the needs of others, the suffering present in daily interactions, and the moments of connection often missed in the rush of life are now recognized. Spiritual practice in everyday life is, therefore, inseparable from kindness and empathy. Awareness and compassion flow together, enriching both self and world. Even in challenging situations, ordinary acts can become profound exercises in presence. Responding to a difficult conversation with calm attention, walking mindfully through traffic, or handling frustration with awareness transforms tension into practice. The awakened do not seek to escape life's difficulties but to engage fully, learning from every moment, turning even obstacles into opportunities for insight and growth. The simplicity of this practice is its brilliance. It does not demand special circumstances, expensive tools, or extraordinary events. It asks only for attention, patience, and a willingness to see life fully. By engaging with the ordinary in this way, the mind gradually settles, the heart softens, and the rhythms of daily life become a continuous expression of spiritual awakening. From this practice emerges a subtle joy, one that is not dependent on external conditions. Happiness grows organically from presence, from attentiveness, from the delicate recognition that each act, however small, carries meaning. A cup of tea, a sweeping motion, a walk through the park, all are reminders that life itself is sacred, and every moment is a chance to awaken. And as this understanding deepens, the mind naturally begins to see the ripple effects of such presence. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, connection grows, and the smallest joys multiply. This prepares the way for the next step, recognizing how even the tiniest moments can create far-reaching impact, touching lives and hearts beyond our immediate awareness. Happiness, when rooted in mindfulness and presence, has a quiet power. It does not merely reside within the individual, it radiates outward, touching others in ways subtle yet profound. The awakened understand that even the smallest joys, when noticed and embraced, create ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment, influencing lives, hearts, and communities. Imagine dropping a pebble into a still pond. The ripple spreads across the water, reaching places unseen. Small acts of attention, kindness, and joy work in the same way. A smile shared with a stranger, a word of encouragement, a moment of genuine presence, each may seem inconsequential, yet each carries the potential to inspire, comfort, and awaken awareness in others. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, not through spectacle, but through resonance. Consider how noticing a flower on a walk can shift one's mood, which then changes how one interacts with others. That subtle shift in energy may brighten someone else's day, leading to acts of kindness that continue the ripple outward. Happiness, when lived as presence, is never solitary. It is inherently relational. The awakened recognize that joy grows when shared, and that the simplest pleasures can have the most enduring impact. In Buddhist teachings, the concept of interconnection, the understanding that all beings are linked, provides the foundation for this ripple effect. Every moment of awareness, every act of compassion, and every recognition of beauty contributes to the well-being of the whole. The smallest joys, attended to fully, become catalysts for change, spreading calm, gratitude, and empathy throughout the world. Even seemingly insignificant gestures carry weight. A gentle nod of acknowledgement, a patient ear, a small offering of help. These moments, when delivered with full presence, touch lives in ways that cannot always be seen. The awakened perceive the invisible threads that connect actions, intentions, and outcomes, understanding that joy, when cultivated inwardly, inevitably reaches outward. Stories of everyday life illuminate this truth. A teacher's encouragement sparks a student's confidence, which inspires creativity, which touches others in turn. A parent's calm presence shapes a child's perception of the world, fostering kindness that grows and spreads. A simple act of gratitude can shift the energy in a room, initiating a cascade of awareness and appreciation. These ripples, born from small joys, flow endlessly, reaching farther than the mind can measure. And it is in this understanding that happiness transforms from a personal pursuit into a living, breathing practice of generosity and compassion. The awakened do not hoard joy. They recognize it as a force meant to circulate, amplifying its effects through attention, presence, and intention. Even the smallest acknowledgement of beauty, the faintest spark of delight, can reverberate in ways that transform not only the self but the world. This ripple effect also nurtures resilience. When the mind sees the consequences of even minor acts of awareness and kindness, it reinforces the value of presence. One learns that life is not a series of disconnected events, but a web of interdependent moments, each carrying the potential to influence countless others. The ordinary becomes sacred, and the simplest joys become instruments of transformation. Through this lens, life itself becomes a living meditation, a continuous practice of noticing, appreciating, and sharing. Each moment of joy, however small, is both a reflection of inner awakening and an offering to the world. The awakened recognize that happiness, like water, cannot be contained. It must flow, creating waves of impact far beyond what can be immediately seen. And as this awareness settles in, it naturally leads to the culmination of the journey, understanding that the practice of noticing, embracing, and sharing joy is not a temporary exercise, but a lifelong path. The mind learns to hold the ordinary lightly, to honor each moment fully, and to awaken to the extraordinary potential embedded in every breath, every smile, every gesture. The journey we have taken together leads to a simple yet profound truth. Awakening is not a distant destination. It is not a title to be earned or a place to reach. It is the gentle, radiant awareness of life as it is here now, in every ordinary moment. The awakened see beauty in the smallest things, joy in the simplest acts, and freedom in the recognition that happiness has always been within reach. Living an awakened life is a practice, not a performance. It is the mindful preparation of tea, the attentive listening to a friend, the gentle step on a quiet path. It is gratitude in simplicity, compassion in connection, presence in impermanence. Each act, when infused with awareness, becomes sacred, and the ordinary is transformed into extraordinary. The inner source of joy, cultivated through mindfulness and presence, flows outward, touching others and weaving a web of kindness and understanding. Even the smallest ripple, a smile, a word, a gesture, has the power to inspire, comfort, and awaken. This is the profound alchemy of the awakened mind. Happiness multiplies, not through accumulation, but through sharing, through being fully alive in each fleeting, precious moment. By embracing impermanence, letting go of comparison, and releasing desire, we free the heart to appreciate life as it unfolds. Gratitude becomes a lens, compassion becomes a bridge, and every ordinary act becomes a portal to insight and serenity. Life itself is the meditation, and every breath, every smile, every glance is an opportunity to awaken. Living in this way is not always easy. The mind will wander, the world will challenge, and obstacles will arise. Yet even amidst imperfection, presence and awareness anchor the heart. The awakened do not seek to escape life's difficulties. They meet them with clarity, gentleness, and an open heart, finding peace in the act of being fully present. And so the journey comes full circle. Happiness is not out there, waiting to be discovered. It is here within, radiating outward through attention, gratitude, and compassion. The smallest things, the hum of life, the warmth of sunlight, the shared laughter of friends, are enough. They are the gateway to an awakened existence. As we close this chapter, remember that every moment holds this potential. You do not need extraordinary circumstances to live an extraordinary life. Every ordinary breath, every ordinary act, when attended to fully, carries the seed of awakening. Awareness and joy are always available, waiting quietly, ready to transform life into a continuous, radiant practice. So, carry this understanding forward. Notice the small wonders around you. Cultivate gratitude and simplicity. Act with compassion. Embrace impermanence. And in doing so, live each day with the quiet brilliance of an awakened heart. Life is alive. Life is fleeting. And life, in all its ordinary moments, is more extraordinary than we often allow ourselves to see. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to pause and breathe. Let the simplicity and beauty of these small moments settle in your heart. And if you'd like to continue exploring the wisdom of Buddhism, discovering how mindfulness, compassion, and gratitude can illuminate your life, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Join us on this journey of presence and awareness, where each video is an invitation to notice the extraordinary in the ordinary, and to live with calm, clarity, and joy. By subscribing, you become part of a community dedicated to awakening, a place to return, reflect, and reconnect with the quiet, profound beauty of life. Remember, awakening is not somewhere far away. It is here now, in each breath, each smile, and each moment you choose to see fully. Subscribe and let's walk this path together.